Hey folks, so today I'm going to do a video on how to change your mindset because it is a very hot topic. It came around probably about 10 years ago. There's actually a book called Growth Mindset as well. And many people have been talking about mindset over the last decade and how that can impact your performance as well as your well being. And I completely agree because mindset is probably the core fundamental aspect to showing up in what we call an optimal state. Some people call it prime state, some people call it a peak state, but showing up in that state is absolutely critical because that's how you actually perform better. So, the work that we do, we focus in two particular areas: performance and fulfillment, because those are very, very important. And in between, there's achievement. But there's no point in performing well if you're not going to be fulfilled, right? So, this is the whole concept. This is the whole circle approach when it comes to how one aspect actually impacts the other aspect. But for all of these elements, whether it's performance, achievement, or fulfillment, one of the most important things is the state that you're in. And the core element to your state that impacts and influences your state is your mindset. And your mindset is simply this: your way of thinking. That's all it is. A lot of people have this convoluted explanation of it. For many people, it's extremely vague and they can't even define what mindset is. But your mindset is your way of thinking. And your mindset either falls into two categories: it's either empowering you or it's disempowering you. It's that simple. It's not necessarily good or bad or good versus evil. It's really, does it enable you? Does it empower you towards your goals, or does it stop or hinder you? If it empowers you, obviously it's empowering. If it stops or hinders you, it's disempowering. So mindsets all just fall into those two categories. That's it. That's why it's so important for you to understand what your goals are, because your mindset must align with your goals. And so what makes up your mindset? Like, okay, so how do you actually change your mindset? People are talking about it, but for the average person, we're sitting here and saying, okay, so, okay, how do I do that? It's like someone saying, hey, go change the oil in your car or change the brakes of your car without you even understanding the mechanics of the car in the first place. And you can do it by watching other people and maybe just by repeating it and trial and error. But if you understand the mechanics of it, it's a lot easier to do. And this is exactly what I'm going to show you when it comes to your mindset. I'm going to show you the mechanics of your mindset, because when you understand the mechanics, it's much easier to shift it. So, not that this is 110% accurate, but sometimes as a trainer, as an advisor, we have to shift things to make it easier for people to understand. So, this is our way of making it easier for you to be able to take this information and actually apply it. But not all of it, or I'm going to say it's not 100% accurate, because psychologists might take a look at this and say, well, that's not 100% accurate, Pradeep. But we do it in a way that you can actually easily consume this information and actually apply it. So it doesn't have to be 100% accurate. What it has to be is practical for you to be able to use it. So this applies to what I call these three buckets of your mindset. Your mindset is made up of three particular buckets. The first bucket is a psychological bucket, the second is a philosophical, and the third is the biological. And what I'm going to want to focus on today is really the psychological element. So, the psychological element is basically the construct of your mind. The philosophical is more of the intentional way of living, right? And the biological are, you can say, genetically based biological elements of your brain and your body, okay? Because biology has absolutely impacts your mindset. Just think of it this way: if you have a really bad stomach ache, it's going to impact your mindset. Yes, you can override the pain and the anguish, but it's going to have an influence and impact on your mindset. Absolutely. The philosophical is something that's more intentional. It's your way of life. You can put in things like principles and so forth. But what we're going to focus on is the psychological. And the psychological elements are basically the natural constructs of your mind. By having a brain, you automatically have a mind. Let me just retract that. By having a human brain, you automatically have a mind. And that mind, no psychologist, no neuroscientist, nobody can really explain what that is in detail with accuracy, because no one has that answer. In fact, many people, it's one of those unsolved questions: is what is the human mind? Like, it's something that's completely intangible, yet it exists, right? It's something that every one of us have minds, but they are completely different because we all have different experiences. But this is the interesting part. Even two people experiencing the exact same thing in the exact same room, the exact same situation, will come out with different perspectives and different mindsets. That's how powerful the mind is. So, what exactly makes up the psychological elements of the mind, which then impacts your mindset? Well, I'm going to do it the old school way, and I'm just going to bring up a diagram here, and hopefully you can see this. Is there's six main elements to your mindset, surrounded by a seventh element, which is your environment. And it's like an onion. I want you to think about your mindset, the psychological elements, as an onion. And each layer of the onion represents your mindset. And there's six layers to the psychological onion I, for your mindset. And the onion at the core is made up of the self. Surrounded by the self is the ego. Outside of the ego is your identity. And outside of your identity is your beliefs, then your stories, and then your values. And all of that is surrounded by the environment. So I'm just going to quickly go through and just, give you a quick snippet of each of these layers. The self is what we call the true self, the big self, capitalized self, which is your soul, your spirit. That's who you are, untainted, unbiased. That's who you would be if society didn't have an influence on you, if your roles and expectations didn't have an influence on you, if you weren't trained by your parents or the school system, your friends, by society, by movies, social expectations to be a certain way. That's who you would be. And many of us have lost that. Outside of the self is the ego. And the ego just simply is. It exists. I just want you to think about it like a barrier. It's either a wall or a barrier around the true self. And what that does is it separates you from everybody else. That's all it does. Ego is not good or bad. It's either healthy or unhealthy. That's all. Some people have a healthy ego. Some people have an unhealthy ego. Maybe it's overinflated or maybe it's underdeveloped. Both are very unhealthy. So, ego is just a way of you separating yourself from every other human being out there, as well as things, right? If you didn't have an ego, you wouldn't know how to differentiate yourself from your dog, your cat, your spouse, whoever it might be. So, it's absolutely essential. Then there's the identity, and that's who you believe you are. That's how you show up, right? And so, who you believe you are determines how you behave because you have to be consistent with your identity. That's how the mind works. So be very conscious of what your identity is. In fact, society will tell you who you are if you don't have a strong identity yourself. That's how powerful it is. And then you will behave consistently with how society wants you to behave rather than how you want to behave. Okay, so there's a difference there. Then outside of that are your beliefs. And your beliefs are your reality. Beliefs are essentially what you believe to be true. And it's this concept of belief is so powerful because if your beliefs create your reality, what does that mean? What if your beliefs are not actually correct? What if they're outdated? Because the vast majority of us have developed our beliefs that we are carrying around with us as adults by the time we're 11 to 13 years old, roughly. And many of these beliefs are at the unconscious level, not at the conscious level, at the unconscious level. So we behave a specific way without even fully understanding why. And that's because we have these inherent beliefs. And outside of these beliefs, then, are the stories that we create. And we all create stories. We do it consciously, we do it unconsciously. We have this part of the brain, or I shouldn't say part, it's how our brain actually shifts from one mode to another, which is called a default mode network, which is kind of like, I'm going to call it the kind of like the la la land, the daydreaming part, where we tend to drift a little bit. And when we get into those drifting states, a lot of the times it's creating stories. So we create stories all the time. And from our experience, less than 10% of those stories are actually factual. So what does that mean? That means you create stories in your life. And most of those stories are 90% fictional. So if you're going to create a story, you might as well create a story that actually works for you, right? That's the benefit of stories. Then outside of stories, you have values. And obviously, values are the interesting one because they actually overlap with the philosophical part of your mindset. So it actually falls within two buckets, psychological and philosophical. And essentially, values are what you hold to be most important to you and what you use to filter and make decisions. So if a certain value, for example, family is important to you, versus money isn't as important, it's not high on your values list, you're going to lean towards the decisions that lead towards family, for example. The tricky part here is that Many of us believe that we have certain values, but we don't act in alignment with those values. So therefore, those values aren't actually our values. How do you determine what your values are? Where you spend your most time, energy, resources, right? And focus. That's what you value. And so we have to update our values. We have to reevaluate our values on a regular basis. I always recommend people at least once a year or twice a year. So those are the 6 layers of your mindset. And then now you can peel them back and say, which of those layers do you need to work on? And each of these layers is actually very complex in itself. I'm simplifying it here for you, but each of these layers can take a lot of work to really establish, bring to the forefront, because many of them are deeply in your, I'm going to say, in your unconscious. And it takes some work for you to be able to pull it out. Sometimes you can do it through friends, self reflection. Sometimes you might need a psychologist or a therapist or a coach or a trainer or advisor, whoever it may be, to help you pull a lot of the stuff out. So those are the 6 layers. And outside of those 6 layers, you have the environment. And the environment absolutely has an impact and influences your mindset. So this is why it's important to understand these 6 layers. If you get very good at identifying these 6 layers and having these 6 layers align with your goals, then the environment has less of an impact and influence on your mindset. This is why a lot of people run around and they're influenced by their mindset to such a large degree that they forget who they are. They forget who what their values are, their belief systems are. And it's really, really interesting what happens to individuals that haven't identified these 6 layers and worked on them. Ultimately, the core or the most important thing here to get out of this, I'm going to call it an exercise, is really have alignment throughout those 6 layers. And ultimately, in that seventh layer when it comes to the environment, but that's the most tricky part. You're never going to be aligned with your environment 100%. That's utopia, right? But the most important thing is to get those 6 layers, get the self, the ego, the identity, the beliefs, the stories, and then the values aligned so you become that much more powerful. So here you have it. If you want to change your mindset, you do it through these 3 buckets. And today I've just covered the psychological bucket, but there's also the philosophical and there's also the biological. So the 6 layers of the psychological, again, are the self, the ego, the identity, your beliefs, your stories, and your values. And then you have the environment outside of that. If you work on each of those layers, you're going to be able to transform your mindset to be extremely, extremely powerful and enable you to get to your biggest goals.